American Encounters, Unit 2, Chapter 3, Reading 1, America's First People. Early contact between settlers and native people. When European settlers arrived in North America at the end of the 15th century, there were approximately 10 million native people who spoke over 300 different languages. The first Europeans believed they had landed in India, so they called the native people Indians. Indian and European cultures were very different, and the two groups often had problems understanding each other. Indian communities stretched from one end of North America to the other, and they all had their own characteristics. Many were nomads who moved across the land to hunt. Like all Indian communities, they had a deep respect for the natural world. They believed that if they took care of the land, they could use it to live on and to hunt. They did not own the land in the European way. In contrast, the settlers built homes and towns, bought and sold land, and wanted to own land. Relations between Indians and Europeans ranged from cooperation to violent conflict. At first, the European settlers often depended on the Indians for assistance and trade. As the number of settlers increased, however, they began to move farther into Indian territory, and conflicts became more frequent and more violent. There was death and destruction on both sides, but native people were usually the losers in these struggles for control of the land. Many Indian communities were destroyed by the actions of the settlers and later on by the policies of the new American government. When the Europeans first arrived, they brought new diseases such as measles and smallpox, which killed huge numbers of Indians. As more settlers came and wanted the rich land that the various groups of Indians or tribes lived on, battles began between the government and various tribes for this land. Loss of Indian land. Indian tribes occupied the entire country when the settlers first arrived. By 1880, they had lost nearly all of it. Starting in 1778, the United States government made hundreds of treaties, or written agreements, with native tribes in order to provide more space for the settlers. Indians gave up their rights to the territory in exchange for food, money, and perhaps most importantly, the government's promise to leave them in peace. Sometimes a tribe was allowed to stay on a small part of its original land. This small area was called a reservation. In other cases, the tribe simply moved west. This was the beginning of the loss of Indian land. Most European Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries believed that whites were superior to Indians. President Andrew Jackson described native people as children who needed his guidance and protection. He, as well as many other Americans, believed the treaties were good for the Indians because they allowed native people to live in peace, separate from whites. Unfortunately, the government often did not keep the promises in these treaties. As the country continued to grow, settlers needed still more land, including the land that the government had given to the native tribes in treaties. The government broke its promises to the Indians and began a policy of removal, that is, pushing more and more native people farther west or onto reservations. In 1830, Congress passed the Removal Act. This law required native tribes to leave their land and settle in Indian territories west of the Mississippi River. Some tribes refused to go, particularly the Cherokee. So, in 1838, thousands of soldiers and volunteers forced the Cherokee to leave their homes. Hundreds of them were beaten, imprisoned, or murdered. Those who survived were forced to travel 1,000 miles to the Indian Territory with little food, water, or protection. Approximately 4,000 Cherokee died on this journey, which has been called the Trail of Tears. Native culture. Another factor that had a negative effect on Native culture was the government's education policy. The federal government's goal for Indian education from the 1880s through the 1920s was the assimilation of Native children into white American culture. Assimilation means that a group learns and uses the customs and culture of a different group. Many Native children were required to have their families many Native children were required to leave their families and attend government boarding schools. The children lived at these schools where their traditional ways were replaced by the customs and behavior of white Americans. The government hoped that these children would learn the language, values, and culture of white American society. This policy of assimilation was partly successful. It is estimated that more than 2/3 of the original 300 native languages are dead or dying. Only a few have more than 5,000 speakers. Today, Native cultures are making a comeback. In 1900, the population had dropped to about 250,000, but it grew rapidly in the 20th century. On the 2010 century, 5.2 million people reported that they were Native American. This was a 39% increase since the 2000 census. The Cherokee and Navajo nations have the largest populations. On reservations, tribes now have their own form of government, tribal courts, and police. Many Native Americans are working to preserve their cultural heritage, including their tribal languages.